The art of loving yourself. The old master lit the oil lamp and slid open the paper door. Outside, the snow covered the ground like a mantle of silence. Inside the small cabin, a young man with a haggard face and eyes full of storms trembled in the dim light. "Master," whispered the young man, "why do I hate myself so much?" The elder took a cup of tea and placed it in front of him. "Drink." The young man obeyed, but with the first sip, he spat out the liquid in disgust. "It's bitter," the master smiled. "This is how you drink yourself every day." The young man frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" The elder poured more tea into the cup and spoke calmly. "When you look at your reflection, you only see the flaws. When you hear your voice, you only hear reproaches. When you compare yourself to others, you always fall short. And so, every sip of yourself becomes bitter." The young man lowered his gaze. "I don't know how to change it." The master blew out the oil lamp, and the cabin was plunged into complete darkness. "Then, tonight, you will learn to see in the shadows." The young man shivered in the dark. "Master, I can't see anything." "That's because you've never stopped to look." The elder's serene voice responded. There was a long silence. Outside, the wind whispered among the snow-covered trees. "Close your eyes," the master said. The young man obeyed. "Now tell me, what do you see?" The young man frowned. "Nothing." The master let out a soft laugh. "Try again. Don't search with your eyes. Search with your heart." The young man took a deep breath. Slowly, images began to emerge from the darkness of his mind. The day he fell and was laughed at, the time he made a mistake and was reprimanded, the moment someone rejected him. All his pain became present as shadows that curled around him. His breath quickened. "Master, I see my shame, my failure, my fear." The elder nodded in the dark. "That's what you've been drinking every day. But tell me, is there anything else?" The young man tried to look beyond the shadows. "I don't know. Everything is covered." The master gently touched his shoulder. "Tomorrow, when the sun rises, we will see if you can learn to taste another sip of yourself." The dawn brought with it a faint glow. The light filtered through the paper panels, casting soft shadows in the cabin. The young man opened his eyes and found the master sitting by the door, watching the snowy landscape. "Come," said the elder, making a gesture. The young man approached and saw that the master was holding 2 cups of tea. "Last night you saw your own darkness," said the master, offering him a cup. "Today you will learn to see the light." The young man took the cup cautiously. "How can I do that?" The elder blew gently on his tea before answering. "Tell me, boy, when you look at yourself in the water, what do you see?" "Myself." "And when the water is disturbed, what happens?" "My reflection becomes distorted." The master nodded. "That is the mind. If it is restless, everything you see of yourself is a distortion. But if the water calms," the young man looked at his tea, seeing his reflection in the still surface of the liquid. "Then, I will see clearly." The elder smiled. "That's right." The young man felt a lump in his throat. "But what if I don't like what I see?" The master set his cup aside and took a handful of snow. "Look at this snow. It's pure white, soft. But if you step on it, it gets dirty. If you leave it on the ground, it melts. Yet its essence never changes." The young man frowned. "I don't understand." The elder let the snow slip through his fingers. "You think you are your mistakes, your wounds, your imperfections. But that's just the snow that's been stepped on. Beneath all of that, you remain pure. You are still you." The young man felt something loosen in his chest, as if a knot that had been there for years began to unravel. How can I see that in myself?" The master smiled gently. "Today we will drink another cup of tea, and this time you will learn to savor it. The master poured the tea into the young man's cup with slow, careful movements. The steam rose in the cold air of the cabin, enveloping the moment in a sacred stillness. "Before you drink, observe," said the elder. The young man looked at the tea, but he didn't understand what he was supposed to notice. "What should I see, master?" "The tea is just tea until you learn to appreciate it. The same happens with you." The young man frowned. "I don't understand." The master took his own cup and held it between his hands. "Feel its warmth. Inhale its aroma. Observe its color. Now tell me, do you still think about what you hate about yourself?" The young man blinked. His mind, which was always trapped in thoughts of inadequacy, was silent for the first time. "No, I'm just here." The master smiled. "Exactly. When you are truly present, there is no space for self-hatred." The young man looked down at his cup. "But my mind always goes back to the same thing, to what I'm not, to what I've done wrong." The elder nodded. "Just as the wind stirs the water, thoughts cloud your reflection. But the water doesn't fight against the wind. It just waits, and eventually it calms again." The young man took a deep breath and brought the cup to his lips. This time he didn't drink hastily. He felt the warmth, the taste, the smoothness of the liquid on his tongue. For the first time in a long while, he felt something different inside. "It's sweet," he whispered, surprised. The master smiled warmly. "That's how your true self tastes." The young man held the cup between his hands, feeling the warmth seep into his skin. He looked at the master with a mixture of wonder and doubt. "Has this taste always been there?" The elder nodded. "Always, but you were too busy looking for bitterness to notice it." The young man lowered his gaze. He remembered the times he had spoken with contempt, the times he had avoided his reflection, the times he had felt he wasn't enough. "How do I stop doing that?" he asked quietly. The master took a small bowl and filled it with water. Then he dropped a pinch of salt into it. "Taste the water." The young man obeyed and frowned. "It's salty." The elder took the same amount of salt and threw it into the lake behind the cabin. Then he gestured toward the water. "Now taste the lake." The young man hesitated but approached, filled his hands with water, and drank. "It tastes fresh," he said, surprised. The elder smiled. "The same salt, but in a larger space. That's how your thoughts are. If your mind is small, any suffering will seem unbearable. But if you expand it, the pain will dissolve like salt in the lake." The young man felt a lump in his throat. "And how do I do that?" The master pointed to the still warm cup of tea in his hands. "By being present, expanding your vision, stopping to focus only on what you think is wrong with you." The young man closed his eyes for a moment and breathed deeply. When he opened them, something inside him had softened. The tea in his cup was exactly as it had been before. But now, he knew he had never truly tasted it until this moment. The young man looked at the lake once more, letting the master's words settle in his mind like snow on the earth. "My whole life, I've tried to change who I am," he said softly. "I've fought against my thoughts, against my reflection, against myself." The master nodded calmly. "And has it worked?" The young man shook his head. "The more I try, the deeper I sink." The elder picked up a dry branch and threw it into the water. "Look at that branch. If it tried to sink, what would happen?" The young man watched as the wood gently floated on the surface. "It can't sink. It keeps floating." The master smiled. "That's acceptance. It doesn't mean resigning yourself, but stopping the fight against who you are." The young man frowned. "But if I stop fighting, won't I get stuck in the same place?" The master picked up another branch and threw it into the river running near the lake. "Where does that branch go?" The young man followed it with his eyes as the current carried it downstream. "It moves with the water." The elder nodded. When you stop fighting yourself, life will take you where you need to be. A chill ran down the young man's spine. And what if I don't like where it takes me? The master chuckled softly. The water doesn't ask if the branch wants to reach the ocean. It just takes it there. And when it arrives, the branch becomes part of something much larger. The young man sighed deeply. He looked at his reflection in the lake, and for the first time he didn't look away. The young man gazed at his reflection in the water, expecting to feel the usual rejection, that sense of something broken in him, of needing to be different. But this time everything was still. I always thought I had to change to accept myself, he whispered. But now, the master smiled. Now you see you were never broken. You were just looking through water that was too disturbed. The young man fell silent. He remembered all the times he had wanted to escape from himself, all the times he had compared his worth to others, as if his existence were a coin that needed to prove its value. The elder picked up a smooth stone and threw it into the lake. Ripples formed and slowly expanded. Look at those ripples. They move outward, but the lake always returns to calm. That's the mind. Thoughts will come and go, but you are not them. You are the water beneath. The young man took a deep breath. Something inside him, something that had been tense for years, began to loosen. Is that how you learn to love yourself? The master nodded. It's not a sudden change, but a constant remembering. One day you'll forget and return to bitterness. But then you'll remember this moment, and you'll return to softness. The young man closed his eyes and felt the wind on his skin, the aroma of the tea in his hands, the stillness of the water before him. For the first time, the idea of being himself didn't feel like a burden, but a possibility. The young man let out a slow sigh, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. Then he looked at the master with a different expression. Not one of doubt, but of understanding. I thought learning to love myself meant becoming someone better, he said. But now I see it just means stopping the fight against who I already am. The elder nodded serenely. That's right. The tree doesn't hate its crooked branches. The river doesn't judge itself by the stones in its bed. The moon doesn't shame itself for its shadow. And you don't have to either. The young man looked at the lake one more time. His reflection was still there, exactly the same as always, but something in the way he saw it had changed. He picked up the cup of tea and took one last sip. This time he didn't look for a bitter or sweet taste. He simply allowed the tea to be what it was. He stood up calmly and looked at the master. Thank you. The elder smiled tenderly. Don't thank me. Thank yourself for learning to see yourself. The wind gently blew, carrying away the last snowfall of winter. The young man looked at the open sky and, for the first time in a long time, felt that he didn't need to be anyone else. He was enough.